Hello there, and welcome to today's video, which is all about autism and identity, and more specifically about a word that I find really difficult to use in terms of describing myself. And that word is woman. So fairly recently, I read this book called But You Don't Look Autistic at All, which I'm sure many of us can relate to. It's by Bianca Toeps, and I was really struck by one section in particular. Before I read it to you, I just need to explain that Bianca is referring to this study here, which is Gender Identity Differences in Autistic Adults by Walsh et al. So Bianca goes on to say, Walsh's study caught my attention because I recognised myself in it. I've personally never felt quite represented by the label woman. I wouldn't want to change myself, but I also won't be forced into meeting certain expectations. I don't want kids, don't wear makeup, and generally don't feel targeted when people make jokes about typical women. You know, the jealous, gossiping, forever shopping stereotypes in high heels. It's fine with me that my passport says female, and I'm also okay with people addressing me with she and her. But somewhere deep down, I think, whatever, I'm not a part of this. I'm just happy to live in a time and a country where that's barely an issue. And honestly, I feel like Bianca could be describing me here. Well, apart from makeup, because that's something I've always been kind of interested in. And I think more in terms of creative expression for me rather than a concession to femininity or anything like that. And I'd say it's helped with my autistic masking because it is almost like wearing a mask. But I was just so heartened to see myself represented in Bianca's words here because I, had never come across anybody who felt similarly to me around the word woman. So, like Bianca, I'm really happy to describe myself and be described as female. And I'm happy to use she, her pronouns, and I feel represented in these words. But when it comes to the word woman, I just don't see myself as this word. I don't feel represented at all by this word. So I guess throughout my life, I maybe had assumed that this might have been because I was born in the 70s, which was a really sexist time. And we can, of course, argue that any time throughout history is sexist or was sexist, but there was a particularly flagrant sexist attitude towards women. It was kind of an accepted form of humour even on TV. And, my parents, I think, were sexist, even my mum, because they had very little ambition for me as a girl and, a girl going on to womanhood. I think they just wanted me to get married and have children and, I don't know, maybe be a secretary up until that time, but I just could not see myself in any of these situations. I just felt very different to what they wanted from me. And as a child, I just desperately wanted to be an artist when I grew up, but this was only ever met with objection, really. And also, I was diagnosed with a dissociative disorder around 20 years ago or so. Although I'm still trying to work out actually if this could be a misdiagnosis or whether it could be part of my experience of being autistic, because we know that many autistic people experience dissociation. And I've always had like a disconnect between my body and my inner self. It has felt really quite separate at times. And I have done a separate video about this diagnosis, and I remember somebody said, and I can't remember who, I'm ever so sorry, said they experienced something very similar and they felt like they were untethered from their body, which makes so much sense to me because at times I've really felt like that, and other times it's felt like somebody could almost rip out my inner self from my body really quite easily. And I think this no doubt informs parts of this dissociation I have from the word woman. So yeah, it's just so interesting. And this is something that obviously I'll kind of need to work out as time goes on, really. And it's kind of interesting that in childhood I was really happy to be described as a girl. I didn't have any issue with the word at all. And in fact, I held on to the term girl for as long as I could, well into my 40s actually. But it feels kind of ridiculous to refer to myself as a 51-year-old girl now. But I really clung on to this word. And, you know, I'm fully aware that many women find the term girl um, really dismissive and infantilizing, even. And I totally get their reasons as to why, but for me, it came with almost fewer societal expectations, really. It's just really interesting to be at a stage now where I can recognize that other autistic people have similar issues with gendered terminology, and I've just been so grateful to find this out. And I guess looking back at my life, I can really see examples where I've really tried to desperately avoid having to use the word woman as a kind of self descriptor. And I can see how I've avoided it actually in many kind of scenarios where I've not actually been involved in, for instance, women's health issues around perhaps pregnancy, because I've never had children, and that was completely my choice. And I have done a separate video about this, but yeah, I've just not had to refer to myself as a woman in some scenarios that perhaps others would. But let me tell you, it was a bit of a shock to the system when perimenopause arrives. So I think basically because I've never seen myself as a woman, I was under the kind of naive and ridiculous impression that perimenopause would never happen to me. I just gave it no heed whatsoever because I hadn't done many of the things that women do in life. Yeah, I just assumed that, this wouldn't happen. So I didn't really have to think about it too much. But yeah, as soon as I hit my 40s, I started getting perimenopausal symptoms, and it took me quite a long time to really attribute this to perimenopause. And I was kind of horrified about it because all this stuff that happens to women was happening to me, and it took me a long time to kind of accept this, really. And because perimenopause had arrived, I found that there were instances where I'd started almost having to refer to myself as a woman, and I would just utterly cringe whenever I would. And, there have been instances even on this channel where I've referred to myself as a woman because it felt like the most appropriate word to use, but still I'd be utterly cringing at having to do this because, as I say, I just don't really see myself represented by this word. And I'm really grateful actually to the trans and non-binary community for giving us more inclusive language. So we can say menopausal person or pregnant person now that perhaps would have seemed, I don't know, a bit more awkward a decade or two ago. So, I'm really grateful to be able to use this language in describing myself as a menopausal, or rather perimenopausal person. And I always use inclusive language on my channel because of this, so that we all can feel represented, because I think gender is just so complicated, isn't it? And I think this inability to recognise myself as a woman has made it really difficult to have friendships with women, because it's almost been like an additional stumbling block. And as autistic people, we very often have difficulties around friendships, don't we, or maintaining friendships. But this has been like an additional barrier, because I haven't had experiences that various women have, such as having children. Very often this is a bonding experience or a bonding conversation between women, or certainly I've observed this in workplaces, and I felt like a complete outlier as a result, really. And I also really dislike all of the stuff that many women seem to enjoy, such as getting my hair done, or I don't know, getting your nails done, or having your makeup done. I just hate all of this kind of stuff. It fills me with dread, and it's gotten to the point where I've been cutting my own hair for years because I can't bear going to the hairdresser. So I don't know, I just feel really separate from certainly this kind of woman. And I've worked with many of these kinds of women who just seem to really embrace all of the kind of stereotypes around being a woman, and I just cannot relate. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today, because I've got some mega brain fog going on at the moment, which is due to some medicine situation I've got going on in the background. So it's frustrating, because I think that this video or this discussion deserves so much more time, really. So I don't doubt it will be a conversation or a topic that I come back to at some points in the future. But ultimately, I just wish that there was another word available for those of us who feel similarly about the word woman, really. It's almost like I need a word that describes somebody who identifies as female, but they don't really subscribe to being a woman. It's something that I'll be working out as time goes on, really, through this new paradigm of knowing that I'm autistic. Because I think once you realise you're autistic, it just, I don't know, opens up so much for us, doesn't it, in terms of our identity, and that includes, of course, gender identity. So I'd love to know if you can relate to anything that I've discussed in today's video. And as I say, I don't doubt this will be a conversation I come back to at some point. So thank you for watching. Give it a like if you got this far, and I'll see you again soon.